everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Washington when a sweet and friendly elderly couple suddenly vanished from their home just days before Christmas in the mid-1980s. A huge search immediately began to try and find them and bring them home. But quickly, evidence was found which indicated that foul play had been involved in their disappearances, later confirmed when their dead bodies were discovered. It wasn't long before the police identified that the motive surrounding this double homicide was probably money. And despite eventually being able to identify not just one, but two top suspects in the case, it would take more than 2.5 decades for the police to actually find the solid evidence that they needed to make arrests and press charges. Let's delve into the shocking case of Ed and Minnie Maurin. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to Ana Luisa for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. If you have been a viewer of mine for a couple of years now, then I'm sure you would have heard me mention Ana Luisa before. They are one of my absolute favourite brands to work with. They are a sustainable jewellery brand. In fact, even if you don't remember me talking about them, I guarantee you would have seen me wearing one of their pieces. I literally wear one of their necklaces in every single one of my videos. I'm gonna say over the last 2 years probably. You can go back and check because I just adore their jewellery. Their pieces are high quality, they're long lasting, they're water resistant, hypoallergenic, and their designs start at just $39, so extremely affordable too. And I recently got 2 new gorgeous pieces from Ana Luisa to add to my collection, 2 necklaces, and I'm literally obsessed. I got this cute dainty little heart which is called the Law Mother of Pearl necklace, and then this one which I think is my new favourite. This is the Ocean necklace. But Ana Luisa don't just offer necklaces, they have beautiful bracelet designs and rings, earrings. Honestly, all of their pieces are just absolutely stunning. And now is the perfect time to treat yourself to them because it's the end of November, it's Black Friday, and right now Ana Luisa are having a huge Black Friday sale of up to 30% off, and the more you buy, the more you save. This is their biggest sale of the year and it's only running for a limited time, so if you are looking to grab some luxury jewellery at unbeatable prices, then the link to the Ana Luisa website will be at the top line of my description box. Ana Luisa also offers free and fast shipping to people living in the US, and they have a 2-year warranty on all of their products too. But let me assure you, their jewellery really does stand the test of time. Some of the pieces in my Ana Luisa collection I've had for, I want to say like 4 years now maybe, and they aren't worn down, they haven't tarnished, they're still in the same perfect condition as they were when I first received them. The quality of their jewellery really is unmatched. So once again, head to the link in the description box, shop their Black Friday sale, treat yourself to some new jewellery, or perhaps pick up a couple of Christmas presents. Thank you so much once again to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you as always to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back approaching 4 whole decades now to late 1985 in Ethel, which is a little friendly town located in East Lewis County in the state of Washington in the US. And this is Ed and Minnie Maurin. They were an elderly couple who lived in Ethel. Edward Maurin was born on the 11th of June 1904, making him 81 years old at the time that this case took place, and his wife Wilhelma, or Minnie as she mostly went by, was 83 years old. So she was a couple of years older than Ed. She was born on Christmas Day actually in 1901. Now Minnie did actually have another husband before Ed. His name was George Hadler, and they had 4 children together. They had 3 sons named Joseph, Delbert and Dennis, although according to one report, sadly Joseph died very shortly after birth. They also had a daughter too, and her name was Hazel. Unfortunately, Minnie's husband died in 1958, so she was a widow for a while until eventually she met Ed Maurin and they married. They married in 1961, so when they were around their late 50s, early 60s, Minnie Hadler became Minnie Maurin and Ed became a stepfather to her 3 children. And by 1985, so by the time they were in their early 80s, Ed and Minnie Maurin were grandparents too. Their kids had obviously had children of their own, and so Ed and Minnie had a number of grandchildren, and they just adored them. They loved being grandparents, and they were living in a lovely house in Ethel in Washington. In fact, their land was huge. It was about 120 acres, much of which was filled with Christmas trees. You see, Ed and Minnie Maurin were actually Christmas tree farmers. That was their business, how they made money, and they lived on a Christmas tree farm. So they were very well known in the community. The majority of people in the area would get their Christmas trees from the Maurins in the lead up to the festive period. And everyone just thought that they were the sweetest, loveliest couple. They were kind and friendly. They were churchgoers. They had a lot of friends. The Maurins were very popular, real pillars of the community. And they loved doing things for their community. They loved socializing. As I said, they would often go to church and enjoy catching up with the locals. But equally, they would love to host parties and events at their home. They loved to invite people in and make them feel welcome. And in fact, that happens to be exactly what their plans were on the day that this case occurred. It was the 19th of December 1985, just 6 days away from Christmas, and that day Minnie Maurin had actually planned to host a ladies' luncheon for the women that went to the same church as her and her husband. Apparently the women of the church would have a luncheon every single month. They'd have a little get together, and Minnie was very excited because this month, the month of December, she had arranged for the women to come and have a luncheon at her house on her and Ed's Christmas tree farm. And as I said, it was due to take place on the 19th of December. So in the lead up to the event, she was getting everything ready, buying everything that she needed to buy. And then finally, when the day was here, her guests started to arrive at the Maurins' address. They arrived at around midday on the 19th of December. However, to their surprise, there was actually no one home. The guests were all knocking on the Maurins' front door, but no one answered. It didn't seem like the couple were in, which was obviously really strange because Minnie knew that she was supposed to be hosting the luncheon that day. So concerned, the guests decided to contact members of Ed and Minnie's family, their children, asking if they knew where their parents were, but they didn't. They also expected them to just be home. And so, sharing their concern, members of Ed and Minnie's family headed straight to their address and they made their way inside of the house. They actually had to force their way in because the doors were locked, which apparently that in itself was really strange because Ed and Minnie were known to often just leave their doors open. So the family had to literally break a window around the back of the house to gain entry. However, when they got inside, they walked around and sure enough, neither Ed nor Minnie were home. And they waited and waited, but hours ticked by and they never returned. I mean, it seemed as though they had gone out somewhere because their car was gone. They drove a 1969 green coloured Chrysler car, which wasn't parked outside the house. So yeah, it appeared as though they had left to go somewhere. But like I said, they waited and waited for them to get back and they never did. Ed and Minnie never came home. So the family started reaching out to friends of Ed and Minnie's and people that they knew in the area, asking if they had any idea where they were, but no one did. No one had a clue where they had gone. And I think eventually the family just knew that something had to be wrong. This was so out of the ordinary for Ed and Minnie. They were very dependable people. The fact that they had plans that day to host an event at their address and they just weren't there, it was so out of character. They wouldn't have done something like that. And so later that same day, on the evening of the 19th of December, the family decided that they needed to call the police and report that Ed and Minnie Maurin were missing. So officers were immediately dispatched to the Maurins' home where they met with their family, their children, and they started just looking around the property themselves. And there were a couple of things that the officers noticed in the home which appeared to be quite strange. Now, there were no signs of forced entry to the home and the house didn't necessarily appear to have been ransacked, but oddly they did notice that Minnie Maurin's purse was just on the floor behind the couch and covered with a newspaper, almost like it had been hidden behind the couch or something. In the couple's bedroom, police also found Ed Maurin's watch, and this seemed really odd because apparently Ed never left the house without his watch, and it was the same with Minnie. She never left the house without her purse. Another thing that seemed odd was the fact that the blinds in the home were closed, and Ed and Minnie were known to always have their blinds open, especially at this time of year, December, because they loved people being able to look in and see their Christmas tree lights. But yeah, the blinds were shut. But the most bizarre thing about the home was the fact that in the bathroom, all over the bathroom floor actually, was a load of papers and a box. It looked like these papers had previously been inside of this box and someone had opened it, emptied it, and was looking through these papers in a rush before just leaving them on the bathroom floor. So police picked up these papers and they discovered that they were actually bank statements from the couple's bank account. And I think it was this discovery in particular that really made police start to think that something sinister may have happened to the elderly couple. The fact that someone had been rooting around their bank statements, it seemed like whatever had happened to them, money was most likely the motive here. I mean, Ed and Minnie Maurin were pretty well off. They weren't mega rich or anything, but as we know, they had a successful Christmas tree business. They lived in a nice house. One of their sons, Dennis Hadler, also had a very successful business. So basically in the town of Ethel, there was a lot of forest land and woodland, and Dennis owned a logging and trucking company. It was called Hadler Logging and Trucking, and in fact it was one of the biggest logging companies in the Pacific Northwest. And so yeah, he was pretty well off. He had a lot of people working for him, so the Maurins were financially stable, financially comfortable, and as we know, they were very well known in the community. So did someone enter their home looking for money to steal? Is that why Minnie's purse was on the floor behind the couch and the bank statements were on the floor in the bathroom? Was this a robbery gone wrong? Had Ed and Minnie been kidnapped for ransom money that the offender wanted their wealthy son Dennis to pay? All of these theories were starting to emerge in the case, and quickly a search for missing Ed and Minnie Maurin was underway. I believe police were searching well into the night, but they never found Ed and Minnie. There was no sign of them anywhere. Now, as I mentioned, the couple's car, their green-coloured Chrysler, was missing too. It wasn't parked outside of their house, and so quickly the police decided to put out an APB on this car, a be on the lookout alert, so that other police departments across the state of Washington knew to keep an eye out for a vehicle matching this description. They also appealed to the public about the car, and just the following day there was a development. The police were informed that there was a green-coloured Chrysler parked outside in the parking lot of the nearby Yardbirds shopping mall. This discovery was reported to them by an employee of the mall. I believe this employee had heard on the radio that this was the kind of vehicle that the police were searching for in connection to the disappearances of an elderly couple, and so they got in contact. So detectives immediately went straight to this parking lot, and sure enough, this green Chrysler was Ed and Minnie Maurin's. It was their license plate. So police approached the vehicle, they started looking around, and as it was a December morning and it was very cold outside, ice and frost on the windows prevented the officers from being able to actually see inside of the car. And so one of the officers used like the warmth from his breath to breathe onto the car window and melt the ice. And when he peered through this little bit of the window, guess what he saw? Blood. He could see blood inside of the Maurin's car. So they proceeded to open the car door. The driver's side door was actually unlocked, and so they opened the door, and yeah, sure enough, there was blood everywhere in this car. It was in the front, it was on the doors, on the seats, in the footwell, and there were also gun shells found inside the vehicle too. It was clear that this blood had most likely come from Ed and Minnie being shot whilst they were sitting in their car. And in fact, there was even a crack in the windshield where they'd been shot, I think through the glass of the window. In addition to that, the police also noticed that the car keys were still in the ignition, a hat belonging to Ed was just discarded in the footwell of the car, and one of Minnie's white shoes was found in there as well, but still no sign of Ed and Minnie themselves. I mean, the blood in the car pretty much confirmed that foul play must have been involved in their disappearances, but where were they? Had they been shot and were injured somewhere, perhaps still being held for ransom, or were they dead and their bodies had been ditched elsewhere by the killer? So as the vehicle was of course a crime scene, it was towed to a police garage where scientists began dusting for fingerprints. They also continued processing the Maurins' home for fingerprints, and the searches for them continued. And as word spread around the area that the Maurins were missing and probably in danger, it wasn't just the police out searching. Hundreds of volunteers came forward too. As I mentioned earlier, Ed and Minnie Maurin were pillars of the community. The town adored them. In fact, they were even described as being like everyone's grandparents in Ethel. So the fact that something clearly horrific had happened to them, it rocked the community. Everyone was devastated, and they just wanted to help their family find them and bring them home. So yeah, there were hundreds of people out searching, and everyone was just desperately hoping that they would be found alive. I mean, it wasn't looking promising that that would be the case given the blood evidence found inside the car, but still people hoped and they prayed that Ed and Minnie would be brought back home safe and well. But tragically, that wasn't to be. Just 5 days after they vanished, there was another development, more news in the case. But sadly, this was the news that no one wanted to hear. The news that 2 dead bodies had been found. It was the 24th of December, Christmas Eve of 1985, when a member of the public was driving down this logging road around this wooded area by Stearns Hill Road in Adna, Washington, which I believe is just under 30 miles away from Ethel. And as he was driving down this road, he spotted what he thought initially was a dummy, like a mannequin, just lying on the ground in a ditch. He actually thought at first that it was one of those dummies that was used to teach people how to do CPR, but when he got out of his car and he walked towards it, he realized, of course, that it wasn't a CPR dummy. He'd found a real human body, the body of an elderly woman, and not too far from her body there was a second body, the body of an elderly man. As I'm sure you've probably gathered, these were the bodies of missing Ed and Minnie Maurin. So immediately this member of the public called the police, and authorities were quickly at the scene, and upon looking at the bodies they were able to confirm that yes, the couple had been shot. It was later confirmed in their autopsies that they had been shot to death. They'd been shot with a 12-gauge shotgun. Minnie had been shot in the neck and left shoulder, and Ed was shot in the back, and it's thought that they most likely would have died instantly. Who was shot first, we don't know, but yeah, it's believed that they would have died almost immediately after sustaining these wounds. Although I did read on one source that apparently Ed did also have some trauma to his head, where it appeared as though he had been beaten around the head prior to his death, that perhaps he was trying to put up a fight, defend both himself and his wife. Close to Minnie's body, the police found a couple of items belonging to the couple. They found a comb, a pair of glasses, and even a set of false teeth. They also noticed that Minnie was wearing just one of her white shoes. If you remember, the other one was found in their car. It was clear that both bodies had been dragged and then ditched on the side of this road. The police noticed trails of blood from where they had been dragged, and also their clothing had kind of like bunched up from where they had been pulled along the ground. And the killer or killers hadn't really made much effort to hide the bodies or anything. I don't believe they were covered with tree branches or leaves, so they were clearly like ditched there in a hurry. The evidence indicated that the couple was shot and killed whilst they were in their car. They were then driven to this location on Stearns Hill Road where they were dumped, and then the perpetrator ditched the car in the parking lot outside of the shopping mall. I mean, it was awful. This was such a sickening crime for someone to do this, to callously abduct and murder 2 innocent elderly people. It sent shockwaves through the community, as you can imagine. People just couldn't understand who on earth would want to do this to Ed and Minnie Maurin. Well, that was what the police had to figure out. Now that their bodies had been found, this case went from being a missing persons investigation to a double murder inquiry, and the manhunt began for the person or people responsible for this abhorrent crime. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was thought early on that the motive surrounding the Maurins' disappearances and, as it would turn out, murders was money, given the fact that their bank statement paperwork was found all over the floor in the bathroom. And when the Maurins' bodies were discovered, even more evidence was found to support this theory. You see, in Ed Maurin's pocket, the police discovered a bank receipt for Sterling Savings, which was the bank that Ed and Minnie were with. So the police got in touch with the workers at this bank, and they actually informed them that Ed Maurin had come into the bank on the same day that he and his wife vanished, the 19th of December 1985. Well, actually, they said that before he came into the bank that day, he called them in the morning at around 10 a.m. and he asked if he could withdraw $8,500 from his bank account. He was going to come into the bank in about an hour or so and pick it up. So he just wanted them to get it ready for him. And so that's exactly what he did. About an hour later, he walked into the bank. He asked for his money. However, he was informed by the bank teller that it wasn't quite ready yet. And so Ed decided to go back outside and just wait in the car. And the teller said that when she went outside to give him this money in an envelope a little while later, Ed actually got out of his vehicle quickly and he met her halfway. He wouldn't let her get too close to the car for some reason, although she did inform the detectives that she believed there were other people in the vehicle. She couldn't be certain of that just because, understandably, she wasn't really paying that much attention, but yeah, she thought that there may have been other people in Ed's car. Now, according to one report, Ed told the bank teller that he needed this money because he was giving it to a family member so that they could buy a car. He was helping them out with buying a car. However, when his family were asked about this, none of them had any idea what the police were talking about. As far as anyone knew, no one in the family had asked Ed for some money to buy a car. So was Ed lying to the bank teller? And if so, why? What was that money really for? Why did he have to withdraw $8,500 on the day that he and his wife were killed? Surely this money must have been connected to their murders somehow. As part of their inquiries, the police, of course, also appealed to the public for information, asking if anyone knew anything about this crime or who may have killed the Maurins. And quite a few people came forward, actually, saying that on the day the couple were murdered, they believed they had seen the Maurins that morning, driving around in their car. However, they also recalled seeing either one or two men sitting in the vehicle with them too. But one tip that really stood out to the police in particular came from two women who said that they were driving through the Yardbirds shopping mall parking lot on the 19th, the parking lot that the Maurins' car was left in, and they remembered seeing their car, their green coloured Chrysler. And they also watched as a man got out of the car and started walking fast, practically running away from the vehicle and towards this wooded area. And they noticed that he was holding an object that looked to be wrapped in a towel or something, and they could just tell from the shape of this object that it was a shotgun. This man was running away from the Maurins' car with a gun. He must have been the perpetrator. So a composite sketch of the man that the women saw was created. They described him as being a dark brown haired man with facial hair. He was white, he was wearing a hat and a green army style coat or jacket, and of course this composite was released to the public. And actually several people did call in following the release of this sketch. Apparently the police received literally thousands of tips with potential names, men that seemed to fit this composite. But there was one particular name that I think came up quite a number of times. It was Mike Hadler, who was actually one of Ed and Minnie Maurin's grandchildren. A lot of people believed that the sketch looked pretty similar to Mike, and so suspicion quickly fell on him as possibly being the perpetrator. But people didn't just suspect Mike because he looked similar to the sketch. They also suspected him because prior to his grandparents' murders, he was kind of known to the police. He was, I believe, around 17 years old at this time, and he had a bit of a temper, and he'd committed mainly kind of low-level crimes, I think, like theft. Apparently he'd stole quite a bit of money from his father Dennis at one point. So yeah, he didn't have the best reputation, and he was looked at closely as a person of interest. Mike denied having any involvement in the murder of his grandparents. He loved his grandparents. He said he never would have killed them, and he claimed that on the morning of their murders he was with his father Dennis as they were on their way to work, and his father did back this up. He confirmed his son's alibi, but despite this, Mike was still thought to be pretty much the top suspect in the case for years. Not necessarily for the police, I don't believe. They pretty much ruled him out, but a lot of people in the community still thought that he was the killer when he wasn't, which is just awful, isn't it really? He was living under this cloud of suspicion for so long, of people believing that he was a murderer when he was innocent. The police did look into other members of the Maurin's family, however they were never able to definitively link any of them to the crime. They continued following up on other tips and leads, and they did have other suspects over the years, but again there was never any solid evidence to connect them to the murders. They were able to practically rule everyone out. And the unfortunate thing in this case was of course the fact that the police didn't have DNA evidence. The couple were killed in 1985 when forensic science was barely a thing yet. It was in its infancy, and so yeah, they didn't really have that at their disposal. And as time passed, the case of Ed and Minnie Maurin unfortunately started to go cold. 7 years on, in 1992, fresh sets of eyes were put on the case. New detectives were assigned to the investigation to see if they could have any luck in solving these double murders. And as part of their new involvement, they decided to, I think, just go over everything again, take another look through all of the tips and leads that had been reported in the case so far over the last 7 years. And there was one tip in particular which appeared to point the detectives in the direction of a woman named Robin Riffe. I think the person who gave this tip literally just said to the police, "You should speak to Robin Riffe." And so in 1992, the new detectives decided to do just that. They decided to reach out to this Robin Riffe. They did a bit of digging and they actually discovered that she was in prison at this time in the early 90s. She was in a women's prison in Arizona for a drug-related offense. So they called her while she was behind bars and they asked Robin if she had any information about the double homicides of Ed and Minnie Maurin, which happened in Washington in 1985. And lo and behold, she did. She informed the detectives that she believed her estranged husband and his brother were the ones responsible for the killings of Ed and Minnie. Robin was married to a man named Rick Riffe, who alongside his brother, John Gregory Riffe, was very well known to the authorities for, of course, all the wrong reasons. The Riffe brothers were around their early to mid-20s back in 1985, and I believe they lived in a neighbouring town of Ethel at the time of the murders. However, about 2 years later, in 1987, they both relocated to Alaska. But whilst they lived in Washington, they had a reputation amongst law enforcement and the local community as being very, very violent and dangerous men. They were drug dealers who were always committing crimes in order to make money, and everyone who knew them were terrified of them, quite honestly. People knew not to mess with the Riffe brothers because they were very quick to anger. Like I said, very, very dangerous people. And now, through speaking to Robin Riffe, the detectives were starting to believe that these two very dangerous brothers may have been the ones who killed Ed and Minnie Maurin years and years prior because of the information that she passed on to them. Robin Riffe's story is as follows. So she claimed that the evening before the Maurins went missing on the 18th of December 1985, she was instructed to drive both her husband Rick Riffe and his brother Greg Riffe to an area which was only about a mile away from the Maurins' house in Ethel, Washington. From what I can gather, she didn't know why they wanted to be dropped there, but she did it anyway. She dropped them off and then she just drove away. And then the following day, on the morning of the 19th of December, she told the detectives that her brother-in-law Gregory Riffe phoned her and asked her to come and pick him and Rick up. And so she drove to the location that they gave her. However, when she arrived, when she pulled up in her car, she actually saw a body, a dead human body. And that was when her husband Rick shouted to Greg, "Get her out of here." Clearly, they didn't intend for Robin to see that. And this location where Robin saw this body was in the same area as where the bodies of Ed and Minnie Maurin were eventually discovered on Stearns Hill Road. Her story put the Riffe brothers at the crime scene on the day that the murders occurred. So now the police finally felt like they had a solid lead to go on. They really believed that the Riffe brothers were responsible for these homicides. However, proving it would actually actually be incredibly difficult. After they received this account from Robin Riffe in 1992, the detectives asked for the state prosecutor's permission to go ahead and arrest and charge the Riffe brothers with these murders, but they were denied. The prosecutor said, no, you haven't got enough evidence. All you've really got against them is this account from Rick Riffe's estranged wife, which she's only giving now 7 years old. As far as I'm aware, she didn't come forward with this account at the time. Who knows, maybe she was too scared of her own husband, what he might do if she did go to the police. Maybe she only just felt safe enough now giving this statement because she was behind bars and he couldn't get to her. Anyway, yeah, she didn't give this story at the time, and given the fact that she herself had a criminal record, the prosecutor knew that she just wouldn't be seen as a reliable witness should the Riffe brothers go to trial based on her testimony alone. And then tragically, just a couple of years later, in 1995, Robin Riffe actually passed away. So the only witness the police really had was now gone. She was dead. She'd never be able to give evidence against the Riffe brothers in court now. And so once again, unfortunately, the case went cold. The police still believed that the Riffe brothers were the likely top suspects in the case, but without solid evidence proving it, they were powerless to do anything, and these suspected killers remained free to roam the streets. Another decade passed, and in 2005, so this is 2 whole decades after the crime, the case was taken over by a new detective, as the old detective on the case had retired by this point. So the Maurin homicide investigation was handed over to Detective Bruce Kimsey with the Lewis County Sheriff's Office, and he spent the next couple of years just kind of sifting through the huge Maurin case file, going over all of the tips and leads and statements, and he, like previous detectives, also strongly believed that those responsible for this crime was the Riffe brothers. So he knew that his job was to essentially build a case against them, I suppose, actually find a sufficient amount of evidence to be able to prosecute them. And I believe it was in 2009 when Detective Kimsey reached out to the sister of Robin Riffe. As we know, Robin had passed away by this point, but Detective Kimsey wanted to find out if perhaps her sister could have had any information which could have possibly been relevant to this case, to building her case against Rick and Greg, and she was able to give Detective Kimsey some more information about what the Riffe brothers, or what Rick Riffe was like the Christmas following the murders, Christmas of 1985, so just 6 days after the Maurins were killed. Wow, she said that on Christmas Day of 1985, her sister Robin and Robin's husband Rick did actually come to visit her with Robin's kids, and she noticed how they all looked very different, I guess, in that they all had brand new clothes. They were all wearing these fancy new clothes on Christmas Day, and they all brought loads of presents for the family with them, which Robin's sister just thought was really strange because Rick and Robin Riffe never had much money at all. The kids were usually just wearing the same clothes that they always wore. They were hardly washed, but then all of a sudden they had new clothes, and apparently Rick also turned up with a load of drugs too, and Robin's sister just remembered thinking, how on earth did they afford all of that when they were usually struggling for money so much? How did Rick Riffe suddenly seem so loaded? Well, of course, the police had their theory. We know that Ed Maurin withdrew $8,500 from his bank account on the day that he and his wife were killed. If they were kidnapped by the Riffe brothers, did they make the elderly couple do this, withdraw this money for them before they brutally murdered them? But that wasn't the only strange thing about that Christmas. Robin's sister also recalled how that day Rick Riffe made these bizarre comments about shotgun pellets. He was asking everyone who was there if they thought that the police could trace shotgun pellets, and why would he feel the need to ask that question unless he was worried that the police would be able to link him to a crime, you know? So that was a very interesting account to receive. I mean, it wasn't concrete evidence against John and Greg Riffe still, but it was, I guess, circumstantial evidence nonetheless. Detective Kimsey was also able to identify another person in the Riffe brothers circle who had some interesting information to share. His name was Les George, and back in the 80s when this case occurred, he was a friend of the Riffe brothers, and he told the police that he recalled driving past the Maurins' property before the murders with Rick and Gregory Riffe, and he pointed to the Maurins' house and made a comment about how much money they had, because obviously they had their own business as Christmas tree farmers, and at the time the Riffe brothers were struggling for money. In addition to that, Les George also said that, again, prior to the murders in 1985, he asked Rick Riffe if he could do him a favour by cutting about an inch off of his sawn-off shotgun, his single-shot 12-gauge shotgun, the same type of weapon that was used to shoot Ed and Minnie. Anyway, Rick said yes, he would cut it down for Les. However, Les said that he didn't actually get it back from Rick until the summer of 1986. So months and months after the murders, and it was really hard to get it back off of him, actually. I think Les asked Rick numerous times if he could give it back, and for some reason, Rick almost seemed to be delaying the return of this shotgun as much as he could. And by the time he did return it, Les George just had a gut feeling that this gun may have been used to kill the Maurins. He had a gut feeling that Rick was involved in their murders, and that, yeah, this gun, his shotgun, was the murder weapon. But instead of coming forward at the time, Les George actually decided to just get rid of the gun, alongside his parents, actually. Les told his parents about his gut feeling, and so they decided to just throw this gun in Mayfield Lake in Washington. And that gun has never been recovered to this day, I don't believe. As well as that, Detective Kimsey also enhanced some old pictures of Greg and Rick Riffe from back in the 80s, and they showed these pictures to old witnesses in the case. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned how many people came forward following the Maurins' murders, saying that they had seen the Maurins driving around in their car on the morning of the murders, and that there were either one or two men in the car with them. Well, when these witnesses were shown these enhanced pictures of Rick and Greg as part of a photo lineup, many of them picked out the Riffe brothers as being the men that they saw in the Maurins' vehicle that day. And thankfully, it was following the accounts of all of these witnesses when state prosecutors finally felt like detectives had gathered enough evidence to arrest and charge the Riffe brothers with the murders of Ed and Minnie Maurin. This was in early July of 2012, approaching 27 years after the crime. And so Detective Kimsey and his team were getting ready to travel to Alaska, where the brothers, who were now in their 50s, were living, to arrest them. However, would you believe it, just as they were about to leave, Detective Kimsey was informed that one of the brothers was now dead. Just a couple of weeks before the arrest warrants came through, Gregory Riffe passed away, reportedly of natural causes, meaning that he was now never going to face justice for this crime, which, as you can imagine, was just so disappointing, not only for the detectives, but of course, more importantly, Ed and Minnie's loved ones. It must have been gut-wrenching for them. You know, these two men, two brothers, had been the top suspects in the investigation for years and years by this point, but the police never had enough evidence to take them to trial, and now that they finally did, one of them was dead. It must have been heartbreaking for the family when they found out that Gregory Riffe had passed away. He'd escaped justice, as I said, but the older of the two brothers, Rick Riffe, was still very much alive. I believe he was 53 years old in 2012, and so as planned, the detectives headed to Alaska to apprehend him. They couldn't arrest Greg, but they could still arrest Rick, and so that's exactly what they did. They made their way to Alaska, they knocked on the door of Rick Riffe's home, which was open, so they made their way inside, and the officers were, you know, making themselves known, shouting, "State troopers here, state troopers," and that was when they heard a man shout, quote, "Who the fuck are you?" This man was, of course, Rick Riffe. He was sitting in a chair in his living room, and it was clear that he was struggling with some health problems at the time. He had an oxygen machine to like help with his breathing and stuff, and the detectives just told him that they were there to arrest him on 2 counts of murder as well as robbery and kidnapping. And his response to this was simply just, quote, "Well, looks like I'm gonna need my medications." Following his arrest, Rick Riffe was extradited back to Lewis County in Washington, and he was held in custody whilst he awaited his trial, as he pleaded not guilty. He was denying all involvement in these murders, and whilst, yes, of course, the police had enough evidence to arrest and charge Rick Riffe and obviously take him to trial for the Maurin's murders, I think they were still pretty anxious about the upcoming trial, because yes, they had gathered quite a lot of evidence by this point, but it was mostly just circumstantial. As I said, they didn't have any DNA evidence or anything like that. They didn't have the murder weapon. The main thing that the prosecution's case relied on was witness statements. But would that be enough to convince a jury of his guilt? Did they have enough witness statements to prove to them that Rick Riffe and his now deceased brother Greg Riffe were the ones who carried out this crime? So whilst they waited for the trial, the police and the prosecution were still working on building up their case against Rick Riffe, and as luck would have it, I believe it was during this time when they had an additional witness come forward, what would turn out to be their strongest witness, actually, their main witness in the case. It was a man named Jason Shriver. Now, Jason Shriver was around 44 years old by this point in 2012, but back in 1985, he was just 70, and he lived in Lewis County in Washington with his family, and he knew the Maurins very well. Jason went to high school with the Maurins' grandson, Mike Hadler, and yeah, he was very friendly with the family. In fact, he recalls going over to Ed and Minnie's house on a number of occasions, and they were always just so lovely and sweet and kind to him. Anyway, on the day that the Maurins were kidnapped and killed, the 19th of December 1985, Jason was being driven by his mother to a dentist appointment that he had that morning, and as his mum was driving along Highway 12, they were kind of stuck behind a car that was driving really, really slowly, and so Jason said to his mother, "Oh, just pass it, overtake the car in front." And so she did, and as she did so, Jason turned his head to look at this car, and he noticed that it was the Maurins. Ed Maurin was driving, Minnie Maurin was in the back seat, however, they were not the only ones in the car. Jason noticed that Rick and Greg Riffe were in the vehicle with them. One of the men was sitting next to Ed in the front, the other was next to Minnie in the back. And Jason knew for definite that it was Rick and Greg Riffe because he knew the brothers. I mean, most people who lived in the area at this time knew the Riffe brothers. As I said before, they had a reputation. Everyone who knew them was terrified of them, and so was Jason. And when Jason later found out that Ed and Minnie Maurin had been murdered, he knew that it was Rick and Greg Riffe that had done it. He literally saw them in the Maurin's car on the day that they were killed. He knew that they were the killers, and it seemed as though the Riffe brothers knew that they had been seen. They clocked that Jason Shriver had seen them as he and his mother were driving past, because just a couple of days later, he was confronted by Greg Riffe, who asked Jason, "Did you tell anybody?" Obviously meaning, did Jason tell anyone that he had seen the Riffe brothers with the Maurins on the day that they were murdered? And Jason replied, no, he hadn't told anyone. And it was following this when Greg Riffe threatened Jason. He said to him, "If you do tell anyone what you saw that day, that you saw me and my brother in the Maurin's car, then you will suffer the same fate as Ed and Minnie. But not only will we kill you, we'll kill your entire family too." And the threats didn't stop there. Jason said that pretty much every single day from then on, I think until eventually they relocated to Alaska 2 years later, the Riffe brothers would drive by his house to intimidate him. They would drive by daily to make him aware that they were always watching him and that they were serious about their threats. If he dared to go to the police, they would murder him and his loved ones. And Jason believed them. Of course he did. And he was terrified to go to the police and tell them what he saw that day, out of fear that he would be next. He would die and his family would die too if he dared speak up. Jason says that over the years he did try to reach out to the media and law enforcement, possibly anonymously, I don't know. But from what I can gather, he never went straight to the detectives and said, look, this is my account. I saw the murderers out of pure fear. And I watched a couple of documentaries about this case during my research in which you hear from Jason, and you can just see how much this secret, how much keeping this secret has completely tortured him over the years. He said in one documentary how he felt like he had betrayed the Maurins, but he was just so scared that he felt powerless. He felt like he couldn't do anything. And so, yeah, I don't believe it was until after Greg Riffe died and Rick Riffe was arrested 27 years after the crime when finally he felt like it was safe enough for him to come forward as a witness. And like I said, this account from Jason was huge for the police, their most damning piece of evidence against the Riffe brothers. And so when Rick Riffe eventually went to trial in November of 2013, Jason Shriver was the main witness, really. The prosecution also called several other witnesses to give testimony during the trial, including Les George, the witnesses who picked the Riffe brothers out of a photo lineup as being the men that they saw in the Maurins' vehicle that day. They also actually had a former cellmate of Rick Riffe's testify during the trial. I think Rick had been kind of in and out of prison for other crimes he committed a number of times in the years after the Maurins' deaths, and one of his former cellmates was a man named Erwin Bartlett, and he testified during Rick's trial that Rick had confessed to him that he'd killed 2 elderly people before. There were about 90 witnesses in total who gave evidence during the trial, and using these accounts, the prosecution were able to piece together their theorized version of events from that fateful day back in December of 1985. So it was clear that for the Riffe brothers, this crime was all about money. They knew the Maurins, they knew they were pretty well off, they had a successful Christmas tree business, which of course would be bringing in a lot of money at this time of year in the lead up to the festive period. According to one source, the Riffe brothers did actually work for the Maurins on their Christmas tree farm at one point, but I'm not sure how accurate that is, so take that with a pinch of salt. But yeah, they knew the Maurins had money and they themselves were struggling for money, and so they planned to rob them. And so on the evening of the 18th of December, they had Rick's wife Robin drop them to an area which was about a mile away from the Maurins' property, and then they walked to their house armed with that 12-gauge shotgun, which actually belonged to their friend Les George. They knocked on the door of Ed and Minnie Maurin, and when the door was opened, Greg and Rick forced their way inside. They shut the blinds so that no one could see in, and it's believed that they immediately started threatening the couple and rooting around the house for money. However, there was none. Ed and Minnie didn't just have a load of cash lying around the house, they had bank statements which the Riffe brothers sifted through, but they didn't have any cash. All of their money was in bank accounts, and so Greg and Rick decided that they were essentially going to hold this elderly couple hostage until the following morning when they could force them to the bank and get them to withdraw a load of money. So they literally stayed in the Maurins' house overnight, threatening them with the gun. I mean, can you imagine how terrified Ed and Minnie must have been? It's awful to think about. The following morning, the brothers forced Ed Maurin to phone the bank and tell them that he was going to come by in about an hour to withdraw $8,500 in cash. And so the Riffe brothers forced the couple into their green Chrysler car at gunpoint. Rick sat next to Ed in the front and Greg sat next to Minnie in the back, and they forced Ed to drive to the bank. Ed picked up the money, which was in an envelope. The Riffe brothers took it from him, and then they forced the couple to drive to this wooded area nearby, and it was there where they shot and killed the couple whilst they were still sitting in their car. They decided that they couldn't let them live, because if they did, then they would probably go to the police, and so they murdered them. Which of the brothers actually fired the gun? We don't know. We don't know whether it was Rick or Greg, or maybe both of them. Maybe one of them shot Ed and the other shot Minnie. But after the couple were dead, they dragged their bodies out of the car and just dumped them on the side of Stearns Hill Road like they were trash, quite honestly. And then whilst one of the brothers was picked up by Rick's wife Robin, the other drove the Maurin's car to the Yardbirds shopping mall parking lot, where they ditched the car to. And as we know, they were seen by witnesses several times that morning. Witnesses saw them in the Maurin's car, including Jason Shriver. Those two women saw a man in an army jacket and carrying a shotgun fleeing from the Maurin's car in the parking lot. But despite being seen numerous times, unbelievably, the brothers were still able to get away with this horrific crime for more than 2 decades, and all just for $8,500. That's all that Ed and Minnie's lives were worth to them, $8,500. But thankfully, they wouldn't be getting away with it any longer, or at least Rick Riffe wouldn't be, because at the end of his trial, the jury found him guilty. And at his sentencing, he received 103 years in prison for what he had done. So it's safe to say that he will be behind bars now until the day that he dies. He did try to appeal against his conviction, however, he was unsuccessful. This appeal was denied, and actually just the year following this, in 2014, Rick Riffe received an additional 6 years in prison for another crime that he had committed, the sexual abuse of a 10-year-old girl, which apparently, again, he carried out in the 80s. So it took about 28 years in total, but finally, the Maurins had gotten justice for their brutal murders, and their loved ones finally got that closure. Again, it's just such a shame that one of the people responsible for this awful crime died before he could face his punishment, but there we are. That concludes this case, the terrible case of Ed and Minnie Maurin. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And of course, it would also be great to hear of any other case suggestions that you may have too. I feel like it's been a while since I covered a serial killer case, so let me know if you have any serial killer case suggestions. A quick thank you once again to Anna Louisa for sponsoring this video, and a reminder that you can check out their Black Friday sale at the top line of the description box. Head to the link down below, treat yourself. And yeah, that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next week for another Mystery with Mollie. Bye.